This meeting is being recorded.
All right, morning everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on another panel discussion. This is going to be a little bit more different than our CPDs we normally do. We have four great speakers with us today. We've got Jen Wallace, Hendra, Graham Locke and Darren Bray. They've all been chosen because they come from different sectors of the construction industry. The aim of the session is to look at challenges of retrofitting from several different lenses. Each of our panelists will answer a question relating to their sector, and at the end we've got a really interesting discussion question that they're all going to answer, and it will give everyone who's watching today the chance to answer it as well in the chat box. We've got several opportunities to answer polls and opportunities for all you guys watching to introduce yourself as well. So it's going to be a really interactive and interesting panel discussion. And as Darren just said earlier, it's incredibly relevant at the moment, retrofitting with the fuel crisis and with what's going on in the news at the moment. But before I get going, we've got some housekeeping we need to go through. Please keep your microphones on mute throughout it. If you want to ask a question at the end, just let us know and we'll unmute you. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat box. The chat box is hopefully going to be quite busy today. So if you've got questions, if you could keep them to the end once we finish the discussion section and then pop them in the chat box, we'll go through them then. The webinar is being recorded. It's going to appear on our Mesh Energy YouTube channel, and it's going to appear on the Meshwork site with all the chat stuff that's going on as well. If you guys are interested, I will relay that all back to you when I send off the CPT certificates. Most of you will know what Meshwork is, but for any of you who don't, Meshwork is an educational community for people who are passionate about sustainable design. We really created it to empower the community to learn from one another through the facilitation of events like today and networking sessions and blogs we write, and as well it'll be the blogs our Meshwork Specialist write as well. So Hendra is the Meshwork Specialist of ours, and he writes great blogs that come up once a month, and they're really interesting, all about heat pumps, and I learn something new every time I read them. So the other thing to let you know is we've reached 1,000 members, and the more people we get on the site, the more opportunities we have to do sessions like today, in-person events and networking sessions. So if you know anyone who is interested to learn more about sustainable design, or you think there's several people in your own community who would really gain something from being part of this community, please do invite them along. Most of you will know Mesh Energy, and you would have seen Doug on this platform anyway, but Doug is the founder of Mesh Energy. It is an independent holistic energy consultancy based in Surrey, but works on projects all across the UK and the globe. Primarily, we work with design teams and architects to make the sustainable design process as simple and as cost effective as possible. Well, that's nearly enough from me. I'm going to introduce the panelists now, but also what I thought would be really great is we've got loads of people today joining and watching. So if you guys are watching, introduce yourselves in the chat box, say who you are, what you do and why you came along. But first of all, I'm going to pass over to Jen to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm the Ops Director at Mesh. I don't always sound like this. I've got a bit of a cold. My background is in the building performance team. So we spend a lot of our time modelling properties, comparing insulations, assessing for overheating, and just generally working out the best energy strategies for a variety of projects.
Brilliant. All right, Hendra, on to you.
So my name's Hendra. I'm a heat pump enthusiast. I spend my day teaching people about heat pumps, sizing systems for people with complicated properties and so on. I used to be a wholesaler in the bad old days, but I've given up selling. So now I'm here just giving advice. I'm very proud to say that yesterday I published my first incredibly boring book on heat pumps called 50 Things You Need to Know About Heat Pumps. It's on Amazon. One day it'll be in paperback when they press the button, but that's me.
Brilliant. All right, Graham Locke, on to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for welcoming me along to your Meshwork event. Really looking forward to it. Yeah, so I'm Graham Locke. I'm the founder of Low Carbon Homes. We've developed a network and a community of retrofit interested members. So basically, we stage regional retrofit conferences around the country, each in partnership with local authorities, and very much focused on the local scene when it comes to retrofit. And we stage all of those events online, and we extend that network into a community which is also staged online, all around the topic of retrofit. So as you can imagine, there's all kinds of different views and challenges from across the country that we try to aggregate and disseminate wherever we can. So this is an opportunity to disseminate some of those challenges that are echoed around the country. So look forward to sharing that a little later.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Graham. All right, Darren, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Darren Bray. I'm an architect and a part-time academic at the University of Reading. So I established my own practice nearly 4 years ago, and I've had a relationship with Mesh for well beyond that 4 years. In previous practices, I've been working with Mesh now, probably getting on for, I don't know, seven or 8 years. So our work at the moment, we're based here in sunny Southampton. Our work is predominantly around reuse, reimagining of existing buildings. I think I would even stick my neck out and say we don't have any buildings that we are designing brand new on greenfield sites. So that's our kind of passion. The kind of main sectors that we're involved in currently, we are highly involved with Portsmouth Diocese on a number of churches, which are getting close to double figures at the moment. One of which we've worked very closely with Mesh on, which has been a bit of an award winner of late, but are increasingly doing a lot more sort of private domestic reimagining of various projects. So we're going to hopefully share a little bit of our passion and a little bit of our knowledge, but most of that is joined up with a relationship with Mesh. So that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's also great to see everyone who's watching introduce yourself. So before we get going and diving into some of the questions we've developed for our panelists, we've got a little poll. So you should have in a sec a poll jumping up on your screen, and you'll have the ability to answer it. So the question's up there, but it should pop up now. If you guys are interested in what the results will be, I can send it to you all after the session. All right, hopefully all of you have had a chance to do that poll, but now we have our first question. So we've got Jen doing our first question. She is going to explain the difficulties when considering embodied carbon in the retrofitting of buildings, and what she would suggest is the right balance between man-made versus non-man-made. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Kat. So probably the best place for me to start on this one is to clarify some of the terminology we use. Embodied carbon is the carbon that's embedded into the construction of the building, and that includes manufacturing, transportation of materials, as well as any carbon that's locked into the materials themselves. We also talk about operational carbon. So this is the carbon that's associated with running the building. So heating fuel, be that gas or electricity or oil, and also the electricity for small power, those kind of things. And then life cycle carbon is when you add those two together, and most methodologies generally assume 60 years of operation. Now, I think we can all agree that saving carbon is good, but the dichotomy is that generally speaking, the best insulations, by which I mean those that have the best thermal efficiencies at the slimmest thicknesses, also have the highest embodied carbon. So a standard PIR, for example, that has about 170 kilograms of CO2 per metre cubed, whereas wood fibre would have 70 kilograms of CO2 per metre cubed. So you'd need roughly double the thickness of wood fibre to give you the same heat retention or thermal efficiency as the PIR. Now, while on paper that seems like a no-brainer, practically the difference between 100 millimetres and 200 millimetres can be really significant, particularly when considering external walls. A homeowner, for example, can decide to insulate internally or externally. Internally, that's a fairly intrusive loss of floor space, and externally, the architect's going to need to consider really carefully window reveals, roof overhangs, gable ends, and there'll likely be planning implications of increasing, you know, that physical size. And it may be that it's simply not possible to reach the same level of thickness. And so one might be tempted to just do the best possible with the most sustainable material. But in my opinion, that would be a mistake. And here's why. Can I have my first graph, please? There we go. I wouldn't be an energy consultant if I didn't bore you with some graphs. So if you take a typical 100 metre squared, 3-bedroom property, sort of 1900s detached, and you insulate it up to the current standards for building regulations, for new builds, I should say, is that you'll reduce the space heating requirement by around 85%, which with a gas boiler, that's about 6 tonnes of CO2 annually. Now, you could reach that saving either by using 100 mil of PIR or 200 mil of wood fibre, and the difference in embodied carbon terms would be about half a tonne. If you only have space for 100 mil, you could reach roughly 1990 standard with 100 mil of wood fibre, or you could just use 50 mil of PIR. Can I show the next chart, please? So here's that operational and embodied carbon compared. The grey represents the operational carbon to reach current building regulations. So you're spending about 3 to 4 times the carbon to hit the standard you would save annually on the insulations. You would save, depending on the insulation selected. And the yellow shows the embodied carbon needed to reach the 1990 standard. And here you're saving roughly half a year's emissions. Those proportions change again if you decided to heat with an air source heat pump. So that's next slide, please. And we can see this significantly reduces the carbon emissions, regardless of the build standard that you've gone for. But when we consider lifetime carbon, next slide. Sorry, next slide. Yeah, excellent. Which is sort of the 60-year impact of that operational carbon. The embodied carbon pales into insignificance. It's a blip on that graph. It's hardly worth me including it on there. There is significantly more to be gained from operational savings. And I believe for retrofit that's where we should be focusing on. Now, I don't want people to walk away from this thinking Mesh Energy said that embodied carbon isn't something we should be focusing on. It is when we're building new buildings. You know, the materials that we're using for structure and foundation, for example, they have a significant embodied carbon associated with them. And for retrofit, they already exist, so I haven't accounted for them here. And the other thing to say is when we're exceeding the current minimum standards for new build standards, so that's, you know, that very small orange blip on the third column, if you were to zoom in there, the embodied carbon, it becomes a larger proportion of the life cycle carbon, and that's when it's appropriate to take it into consideration. And that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jen. That was really interesting. And it's, yeah, good to clear up that you still care about embodied carbon as well. But yeah, that does make sense. You do have to balance it out and understand what is needed with a retrofit building. All right, next up we have Graham Hendra. He is going to be talking about the challenges with installing renewable energy when retrofitting. So it'd be great to hear, in your opinion, what are the major barriers to implementing renewable energy on a retrofit project, and if there's any projects where it just hasn't been relevant to retrofitting.
Okay, so for me, the biggest challenge in in heat pump designing is when you have a heat loss which is greater than the heat output you can get from a standard off-the-shelf heat pump, which is scarily frequent in the UK because we have appalling houses. So can you give me my first and only slide? So this little place here is the house I was born in. I was actually born in the room at the top left, which in the 70s was quite trendy, apparently. I don't know what my parents were thinking, but this is my parents' house, and I use this all the time as a case study of houses which are impossible to heat with heat pumps. So this ridiculous place is 200 meters squared. It was built in about 1800-ish. There is no insulation anywhere. It's single skin brick throughout, solid floor, thankfully, so it's not vented. There is no loft, so there's no loft insulation. And just to really get the heat loss up, those windows are all proper leaded light windows. Just to make life even easier, it's listed. So my dad said to me, "You're into heat pumps. I want to be green. I'm currently spending, well, now he'll be spending about £5,000 to £6,000 a year on gas. Let's stick a heat pump in." So I'll give you some really, really rough numbers. The heating system in that house is a gas combi boiler. It has no hot water cylinder, and bizarrely, there's no room for a hot water cylinder. That cupboard went a long time ago for my mother's shoes. It's got 20 radiators in it, all of which were put in 1970. So they're all awful, they're all small, and they all have to be run at just under dull red hot to keep the house hot. So to put a heat pump in here, nobody makes a heat pump, a domestic heat pump, which will give 20 kilowatts of real heat. So we're going to have to put two in. So the first challenge is, if you put two heat pumps in, you always need planning permission, which you're not going to get because the house is listed. But apart from that, we'll keep going. The other problem is that the power supply into these old buildings is quite small. So this house only has a 60 amp single phase power supply. Two heat pumps would need 32 amps each. So we've already exceeded the power supply. So we need to ring Southern Electricity and start talking about that as well. So bearing in mind that insulating is very, very difficult to do unless you go inside. I thought I'd throw you some really interesting numbers, because these, when you read ridiculous articles in newspapers about heat pumps cost £25,000 and they're a disaster and so on, people like Roger Bisbee are talking about my dad's house, which are really not, standard fare. So to give you some ideas, two heat pumps, 20 kilowatts is going to cost you £20,000 to install. We're going to need to change every single radiator in that house unless we can find a machine that runs at 75 degrees. We allow £300 a radiator. So 20 radiators is 6,000 quid. We've got to put a hot water cylinder in and build a nice airing cupboard to go around it. We're going to stick that in the lounge. That'll look nice. So for a princely sum of £28,000, we can get you a couple of heat pumps in there and get you off gas. And if you were trying to make a case for not selling heat pumps, this is exactly what I would use all day, every day. This is not the sort of place that is very easy for us to do. There are ways of solving this issue. Obviously, insulation would be the best one, but my dad's 84 and can't see the payback. So he's going to let whoever buys it after he dies worry about that problem. But one of the things that we look at is, how about taking this system, this house, and kind of making it into a hybrid heating system? So we're going to leave the gas in, but what we're going to do is put a heat pump in to do a bulk of the work, maybe 60 to 70% of the heating. So we're going to use the old radiators and so on. We're going to let the combi boiler continue to heat the hot water, so we don't need a cylinder. So we've just saved ourselves 6,000 quid on the radiators and 2,000 quid on the hot water cylinder, and we only need one heat pump. So once we get down to one heat pump, what we're going to do is we're going to be able to get it onto the power supply that the house has. We can probably get it through under permitted development if we tuck it around the back of the house. So essentially, we've got ourselves a solution here of a partially green heating system. So a renewable heating system that does 70% of the work, and a fossil fuel system that picks up the last bit. So the way they work is when the weather gets cold, maybe 3-4 degrees outside, what we're going to do is turn the heat pump off and allow the boiler to run just as it did before we turned up. So this sort of hybrid system is such a great idea that they are no longer incentivized under the new super duper boiler upgrade scheme. The government have decided they don't like hybrid systems. So if you wanted to go for a hybrid system, you would have to pay the whole lot yourself. If you went for a system where the boiler was replaced, you get a grant of £5,000. But in this particular case, a hybrid system would go into that house for something of the order of £7,000 to £9,000. So this is the absolute ideal solution in a house like this. The sensible solution, which I'm sure the guys at Mesh will love, is to buy a bulldozer and flatten it. And if you flatten it and build a new house, we'd save an enormous amount of carbon. But weirdly, that kind of thing is frowned upon somewhat in this day and age. So that kind of gives you an example of a job which is very difficult to do with a heat pump. Most houses aren't that big and that badly insulated, so they're easy. But I thought I'd share you one which I've never managed to get the order for. And that's me.
That's brilliant. I actually have one quick question with that. So obviously that's a really, really old house, but for like a standard terrace house, would you come across similar challenges with having an air source heat pump installed, because it's most likely going to be that instead of a ground source?
Yes, I mean, again, obviously terrace houses, Victorian terrace houses have quite high heat loads as well, but because they're not as big, you can usually get them into a single unit. And one of the things, sat behind me is a unit that I'm experimenting with at the moment, which is they're bringing heat pumps out now that are able to run at 65 or 70 degrees. So what we're looking at now is, instead of changing radiators, changing cylinders, changing pipework, literally a case of take out the boiler, replace with a high temperature heat pump. In it goes. Very, very simple to do. It's not as green, but it's a lot easier to sell it to the customer. It's a lot easier to get them into the renewable technology if you don't have to dismantle most of the house. And I'm a great believer now, I've sort of had a change of view, which is, isn't it better that we get them onto something that's at least a bit green than leaving them on a gas boiler?
Yeah, true. And we all need to start making changes pretty quickly. And if that's the first step into changing to a full heat pump system in the future, yeah, it does sound pretty positive. All right, thank you so much, Graham. That was really interesting. I think a few people in the comments have already thanked you for that. I'm going to run on to Graham Locke, who's next on our panel. And he's going to be answering, I think this is going to be particularly interesting, coming from Graham with his experience with low carbon homes, is we know retrofitting can provide an influx of new jobs, but can we bridge the skill gap at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kat. Nice, easy one. Well, the simple answer is no one really knows at the moment. As far as we're picking up through, as I mentioned, the retrofit conferences that we stage around the UK, this comes up time and time again. But I think, before I sort of share some of the insight that's sort of flowing through from those at the coalface, I just wanted to echo the previous Graham's comments around this emerging sort of pragmatic view when it comes to retrofitting, in that I think there is a sort of growing recognition that we are on a transition here, that we don't need to do everything overnight, although obviously that would be ideal if we could just click our fingers and magically end up in this decarbonized world. But a pragmatic transition, bringing customers and residents along with us on this journey, I think is the very least we should be doing. So those kind of compromises that Graham mentioned, albeit short term, at least it's on the start of a journey. So totally echo that. But on the skills challenge, yeah, no, it's a real challenge, and particularly acute now, as many of the local authorities that we deal with across the country and the housing associations that they work really closely with are some of them are quite awash with funding from social housing decarbonisation fund and other sort of central government funded sources that are enabling them to fulfil their sort of project dreams in many ways in terms of the decarbonisation of their stock. The real challenge now is locally in those local authority areas is not actually the funding, because many have got substantial funds. It is this skills challenge. You know, where are the workers that are going to deliver this work when many of those trades that we would recognise as traditional construction trades are busy already? You know, the average, and it's a declining market. So the average age, I think, of a heating installer is something like 55. There are more people leaving the market every year than there are entering it, and that's pretty common across all of the trades in the whole construction sector. So there is a looming crisis here in the delivery of these funded ambitions from central government, and obviously that I'm sure feeds through into the private sector as well, as many of your members will perhaps recognise. So there are growing calls for long-term view from government of the future policy. The market wants to see a pipeline of work that is not going to fluctuate and is not going to be focused on short term, or where the rug's not going to be pulled because it's perhaps not working. So there's definitely a need from government to show what the trajectory is and to demonstrate to the industry that there is a long-term pipeline of work flowing through. So there needs to be some consistency there. But we also need to encourage new market entrants. The existing pool of talent and skills is not going to meet this demand. So we've heard, I think as a speaker at our Liverpool event, was from one of the local colleges, talking not only about the skills that need to be developed, you know, the refined existing construction skills in terms of retrofit coordination, people skills, and some of those softer skills as well, but also, you know, the standards that are now going to be required is that much higher than many have been used to in the construction sector. So from a college perspective, they're busy feeding the existing market with qualified people that can undertake those work. And obviously that's what they're focused on at the moment. But then if they're also to provide additional courses for these sort of new skills, these skills that are being transitioned both in heating and in insulation and so forth, then those in training also need to be taught those new skills as well as the existing skills. So then they've got this sort of double whammy of having to meet both the existing market and this emerging market when the emerging market isn't yet defined. So it is a genuine challenge, and one of the opportunities that we've recognised in the discussions that we've had with a number of stakeholders across the country is that there's a golden opportunity here for new market entrants to come in, perhaps from those that are underrepresented in the market at the moment, those that might have some means of social exclusion or at least opportunity not offered to them as much as they might be. There are schemes and charities that support many to get into work. Could they not be this new retrofit army? We saw a fantastic example in Manchester where theatre workers that were made redundant during COVID basically repurposed their scene setting skills and their light technician skills to become retrofitters, and they had a fantastic journey to that work transition, and it's actually opened up many more opportunities for them, and most actually aren't even going back to the theatres. So there are good examples of transferable skills and and retrofit can be an amazing market to enter if the conditions are right, and if we are all consistent in explaining what that market opportunity is, and the fact that even those with relatively low skills can still play a role in helping us transition to a low carbon market. So no holy grail of answers there, I'm afraid, no silver bullet, but hopefully some stimulation for the discussion a bit later in terms of where this retrofit workforce is going to come from.
That's really interesting. I think what particularly, I mean, it's amazing hearing what happened in Manchester. Would it be useful, sorry, and this has just popped into my head, but would it be useful for kids that are going through college to have apprenticeships which go into filling this skill gap? Is there possibilities for apprenticeships at the moment in and around that area?
There are, but the challenge is one for the market to communicate this career opportunity. So so many kids in school, I'm sure, don't even know what retrofit is. They might have a perception of construction that isn't what we might imagine the modern retrofitter to be in the future. The skills are some of the skills are similar, but some of the skills are different. There's a lot of communication required, a lot of calculations required, as we heard earlier, a lot of analysis, a lot of behind the scenes computer related work in terms of analytics and the generation of complex algorithms to solve complex problems, particularly in older buildings, as we heard from Graham. You know, it's not the crude construction world that many imagine, and I think there's a job of work for all of us there to inspire the young and to demonstrate what this new career opportunity could be.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and it's definitely a topic I think we all need to dive into a little bit more, because it's going to be relevant for every industry in the built environment. All right, so last we've got Darren coming up. He's going to be talking about the architect perspective, and he'll be saying what role does he think architects have when it comes to retrofitting the UK housing stock, particularly in light of the fuel crisis, which is on the news constantly at the moment?
Good afternoon, everybody. So, yeah, quite an interesting question, this. What role do you think architects have when it comes to retrofitting the UK housing stock in light of the fuel crisis? I just want to pick up on something that that Graham was just talking about, which is this element around kind of the next generation. Now, whether that's the next generation of people in the construction industry on site, or whether it's the next generation of architects. I spend 25% of my week teaching at the University of Reading, first years, and I can tell you that 18-year-old students coming out of A-levels studying architecture, this is something that they are all interested in, and therefore actually those of us now who are in the industry and have been in the industry for some time, our role is huge. Now, one of the biggest challenges is when you talk about retrofitting in our industry, in architecture, it's not seen as particularly glamorous, but I think from our perspective personally here in practice, I think there are sort of key points and elements that need to be kind of understood, and if you don't understand them, it's about working with people that do, and so our job really is one of coordination, I feel, and it's kind of thinking about fabric first, it's thinking about energy assessment of existing stock, it's thinking about, you know, what renewables are there to be considered, it's thinking about costs, it's thinking about VAT, it's understanding all of those things, because they have a major impact on whether or not you can deliver a project fully through the whole kind of retrofit possibilities. It's about design opportunities as well. And if I think currently here, if I give examples, in the last month, we've been approached by two different private domestic clients who've been living in properties for some time and are now saying, well, you know, I'm faced with these huge fuel bills. What's the point in kind of leaving investments and money in the bank? Why would I not look to invest that money in my property to reduce my outgoings? So first of all, how do you kind of understand that? Now, for example, we're just finishing a retrofit conversion of an old Victorian farmhouse, and we took some expert consultation from a VAT expert who did a whole assessment of the site, and we've managed to rate the VAT on that project back to 5% from 20% due to the fact of that building being empty. So overnight on this project, we saved the client somewhere between 150 and 200,000 pounds of value that then went back into the project. So I think, you know, my main advice is that, you know, we're not experts on a whole bunch of this stuff, but we need to know where we can kind of assist and give really good advice to clients in terms of looking at where they might put budget back into their retrofit project. So how do we do that? Well, I think it's absolutely critical at an early stage to work with somebody like Mesh. Now, I'm not here to plug Mesh, but we've had a very, very good, strong relationship with Mesh over a long period of time. And we're now bringing them in literally at the moment where we're starting feasibility studies. So although clients are coming to us saying, you know, we need to kind of consider, you know, the architecture, fundamentally, what many clients just over the last 6 months of this year are now interested in adding budget to their projects to be able to do a complete assessment of where they might put their money. And I think bringing somebody at Mesh in at an early stage enables us to do two things. It enables us to do an architectural feasibility study, and it allows somebody like Mesh to do an energy feasibility study so that the two can be coordinated and brought together. And at the moment that we then present that back to the client, we can then bring in the quantity surveyor to do an overall assessment of where that client is going to put their budget. Now, I won't sit here and say we are experts in knowing how best to deliver fabric first or retrofit. What I will say is that we're open to looking at all of the possibilities. And it's really important, I think, for architects to engage with this now, because although there isn't a push within our industry or within building regs to kind of get to a particular level to address some of the challenges around, you know, where we need to get to with climate change, I think there's a really interesting, good pipeline of work, and we can learn as architects as well. I think that's critical, and that's very much part of my thinking, being a sort of part-time academic, is that it's really important to work with you know, many of the people that have spoke this morning to kind of understand, but fundamentally I want to come back to that sort of coordination position, is that I think it's really important for architects to have a very open mind as to where you're going to apply a budget for the kind of retrofit elements, whether that's the fabric, whether that's, you know, triple glazed windows rather than double glazed windows, and then look at the architecture, because our job as creative problem solvers is to enable a client to be able to deliver and build in all of the kind of renewables and the approach to the fabric, while still producing an excellent piece of architecture. And, you know, just to give you one other example, we've worked with Mesh on a church project over the last 3 years, where fundamentally Mesh's input on that was absolutely critical, because we were able to solve the client's first challenge, which was how do they heat a church. And then once we'd done that, we were then being enabled and given permission by the client to then move on to deal with the interior and the architecture. So I think, you know, as I say, even in the last 6 months, you know, most of our inquiries in private domestic are around the reuse and reimagining of existing buildings. And I think as architects, we need to probably do as much as we can in terms of increasing our education and understanding, what the possibilities are. And I think it's really interesting. I've learned stuff already this morning, listening to the conversations around, heat pumps and what's possible. So, this stuff is changing fundamentally, month by month, year by year. And I think as architects, we need to make sure that we can still do architecture, which is our real passion, but at the same time, we can do architecture and we can do retrofit and we can be addressing climate change. So I'm just going to sort of wrap up now and just kind of hammer home that, as architects, our role in looking at the existing housing stock is absolutely fundamental, and it's only going to get more intense. I would say, we had a client that walked into our office yesterday who wanted to come and talk about a proposal that we put forward. And the first thing they said was, we're really keen to appoint you, but is it okay to increase our budget to add in a whole review of the fabric of the building? So I think, we've just got to be, ready to kind of adapt. And, as I say, we're really quite passionate here that we're not interested in doing big shiny buildings on greenfield sites. So I'm just going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Darren. That was really interesting to hear, and it's great to hear between particularly you and Graham the collaboration opportunities that are coming up. Obviously, accepting that when you're doing a project, you need to collaborate with others to get the fulfillment out of it and to help actually reduce this fuel crisis we're in. I find that particularly interesting. What I really want to quickly ask before we jump onto the discussion question is, with the fuel crisis hitting now, have you seen an increase of referrals for people wanting to refurb their house?
Yeah, totally. I mean, an inquiry that we had about 4 to 6 weeks ago was through an architect friend of ours who designed a building back in 1988. It won an ROBA regional award in South Devon. That particular house was designed with a swimming pool. That client can no longer use that swimming pool because if he did, his fuel cost would be somewhere in the region of about £4,500 a year. So we are now being asked to consider doing a complete holistic overview of that building. So some updating, maybe some replacement of windows, but a fundamental review of the pool building, a fundamental review of the heating. And our first port of call was to recommend that we spend a day with Mesh on that house. So, and I think that's just one example of many.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I think we've been seeing as well, there is a lot of traffic coming to renewables and refurbs at the moment that is just unheard of and hasn't really been seen beforehand. But that was amazing. So you've now seen everyone's quick question. We've got a discussion question now. So if you could pop to the next slide, Nazrin. I'm going to let each of our panelists answer this question because I personally find it quite interesting because we've covered the different sectors, but the thing that links it all and the thing that's going to accelerate change is the policies and the politics around it. So we're going to let Jen, Graham and Darren have a chance at answering this. But obviously all you guys are here and you're from different sectors as well. So we'd love to hear your responses to it. So pop down your responses in the chat box as well. And if we've got some time at the end, we'll go through any questions as well. So if you were in charge of the political retrofit agenda, what would you prioritise? Jen, if I could come to you first with that.
Sure. So I've kind of come at this question from the direction of how policymakers can encourage and facilitate homeowners and landlords to improve properties like beyond just direct subsidy. So since 2018, in the rental market, there's been minimum energy efficiency standards. So based on a property's EPC, that property must meet, like before it's rented out, a minimum value. And at the moment it's E, and that rises to a C in 2030. And I think in the context of the rising fuel costs, this program should be advanced more quickly. It seems really deplorable to me that it's, you know, it's the poorest that are going to be stuck with the highest fuel bills, particularly when you think, you know, they're often on expensive prepayment meters, which exacerbates that situation further. I think that would be an easy lever to pull to speed that up and make life better for a lot of people. And then I was also thinking, you know, for those of people that own their homes, I think there's an opportunity to recognise the impact that having an energy efficient home has on mortgage affordability. Perhaps this could be leveraged to allow people to borrow more from their bank in order to make improvements to their properties. And it would certainly elevate, you know, public awareness of these EPC ratings when purchasing properties, because at the moment it doesn't feel like energy efficiency is a consideration for most people when they're making a purchase.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we had Philippa Birchwood a while ago she was asking Rightmove to add their EPC rating to all their rental and all their housing stock they had on it, so you could use it as a filter when you're looking for houses. So having like aspects of that to be able to filter even when you're looking to buy or rent would be amazing, because I think I mean I've been looking around recently, and when I look at something below C, I just have no interest in wanting it. But I'll be talking to friends that aren't in the sector and they have no clue. They're like, what is EPC? And I was like, you need to know this, it's going to cost you a lot.
Yeah, same. I've got friends who, you know, just purchased kind of period Victorian properties, and they're like, oh, isn't it lovely? Oh, yes, it's lovely, but it looks very chilly.
Yeah, very, very cold. Cool. All right, that was brilliant. Graham, you're next.
There's loads of things I'd like to change, but I thought I'd try and focus on things that might actually have a chance of getting through. So this might sound a bit mental, but our industry, heat pumps, are notoriously poor at any promotion, any lobbying and so on. We just don't do it. We don't spend any money on it, and so on. So actually nobody even knows what a heat pump is. That has changed enormously in the last 12 months. Mostly because of things like COP26, Boris talking about heat pumps. I'm sure he couldn't spot one if he tripped over it. But the fact that the press are talking about heat pumps is positive. Our industry has doubled in size purely because of that. It's nothing to do with run cost. It's because people have actually heard of heat pumps. So what I'd ask them to do is just keep talking about it. Even if it's negative, just keep talking. That'll do. So that's something that might actually happen. The tragedy of our industry is, and I mentioned this a little bit before, we are the only country in the world where you have to go to your electricity supplier and tell them you're putting a heat pump in. We fill in a form called a DNO form, and in huge numbers of cases, the DNO says no, which is insane. So you can go and buy yourself an electric Arga, you can buy all sorts of electric appliances which you just plug in and don't tell anyone, and that's fine. But if you want a heat pump in, an idiot can tell you can't do it. And unfortunately, I think that is the first thing I would do is the DNO, there's no excuse. You can just fit a heat pump anywhere and make that change. I think it's simple. It will never happen, but it's what I'd like to see changed.
That's really interesting. Can I ask why they would say no in the first place?
And this is where the fun begins, right? So so the DNO are the people that own your electricity meter and the lump of cable that comes out the ground and feeds your house.
Yeah.
And due to massive lack of investment, they have absolutely no idea what's in your house. They don't know how big the cable is, the fuses, and so on. So what they're actually doing is getting you to fill in the database that they never filled in. So at the end of your road will be a transformer, which they don't know how big it is. They don't know how big the cable is and so on. So as you do your heat pump, you're slowly giving them the data back on the things they own. And basically, the infrastructure in some areas is very weak. In other areas, it's amazing. And you might be lucky in your roads, you might be able to get a heat pump in. It's not just heat pumps, by the way. If you go for an EV charger or solar PV, you also have to fill in this ridiculous form. I think the government should push back to the suppliers and say, we're going green. You need to sort this out, lads. Yeah, you've got to get the cables in the ground. If they're not big enough, tough, put them in.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good, I honestly, I had no clue about that. That's opened my eyes. All right, Graham Locke, you're up next. What would you prioritize?
Well, it's a really small ask, but it's a strategy.
Oh yeah, that'd be nice.
Simple word, strategy for retrofit that provides a program of work that gives market confidence that this is the trajectory that everyone needs to go on, with a program of funding and various other incentives to help encourage all property owners to participate. And that is likely to feature building passports. That would then also support some of the suggestions that are in the chat already around green loans pegged to the property rather than to the householder. All kinds of things would become unlocked. Contractors would invest in their teams because they can see that this is where the country is heading for the next 20, 30 years. Colleges, schools, likewise, that everything becomes normal and predictable, and therefore investable in, which will then bring the private sector along. But the trouble is, retrofit is really technically challenging, as we've heard, and very, very difficult, I suspect, for government to get their heads around the number of moving parts and the variables that don't provide a nice shiny project for them to hang their success on. And of course,
Yeah.
the government itself is geared around 5-year periods, which don't support those major infrastructure investments, unfortunately.
Yeah, don't get me started on the 5-year periods. But no, I mean, that's very, very interesting. I mean, we've got all you guys here today and you're from 4 different sectors. So having a structure that wraps around everyone who is involved in retrofitting from the point it's developed to the point it's finished, I can imagine being very difficult, but it'd be great to have something like that sorted, so yeah, we can get people skilled up and ready to go and fly with it. You mentioned something about a building passport. I was quite interested by that. I haven't really heard about that before.
It's a concept that many support, including REBA, I think, and the Federation of Master Builders and CITB and various other trade bodies, that basically enables any improvements or any works actually that happen to a particular property to be logged. So basically it starts off with a retrofit plan. So the building has to be assessed with a program of suggested works that would get it to perform better than it currently does. Now, to Graham's point about his parents' home, so there would be where the property is now, how it could be improved to perform better to meet government targets. But the amount of time that it takes to get from where it is to where it needs to be is down to the owner of the property, not necessarily the current owner of the property. So to your point about the visibility of EPCs on Rightmove and so forth, there would be you can imagine a bar chart showing its progress towards net zero. And you buy a property now and it will be on 0, and you buy a property in 10 years' time, might be on 5%, but if someone's invested heavily in that, it might be on 25%. But it's basically then handed over. So the baton is then handed over to the next owner, and they then do what they want to do, and to over time gradually improve the performance of the building, but taking into account the trigger moments throughout the building's life and the habit, the living habit of its current occupants. So if you're having a new replacement bathroom or kitchen or conservatory or whatever put in, that would then take into account, that would be a trigger moment where you would use that intervention to improve the performance of that aspect of the building, which forms part of an overall plan. So it's not doing these measures in isolation, but working towards a conclusion.
That's really interesting. It sounds like something that should definitely be implemented sooner rather than later. That's been brilliant. Thank you so much for explaining that. So Darren, would you be able to jump on and say what you would prioritise for the political retrofit agenda?
Yeah, I mean, two simple things really. I'll keep it short and sweet. I mean, our industry has been lobbying central government for some time now around VAT on existing buildings, which has a massive impact on any project, because if you're not having to spend 20% on works to an existing building, and you're able to put that back into your budget, and maybe you spend all of that 20% on fabric first or renewables, it has a major impact on your project. And you know, we've ended up with situations where a client come to us and say our budget is X. We had this last week. Client came to us, said our budget is X. What do you think? And I said, it's a bit of a struggle, because if I look at the architecture and I look at the renewables you want to do, there's going to be a real sort of headache between the two. Now they are people that are retired, so you know, they walked in here yesterday and said, look, we're going to up our budget, no point leaving it in the bank. But imagine if they'd upped their budget and then they'd got an extra 20% on top of that, they could have gone even further with their whole retrofit. So that's the VAT element is a real challenge, and it's why a lot of architects sort of move away from these projects, because you know, there's not more to go into the shiny things, the architecture, and I think a more consistent review of building regulations fundamentally in terms of Part L, because I think you know, if we go back 10 years ago, you know, there were going to be some quite significant changes around Code for Sustainable Homes. I'm not saying that you know, was the right approach, but it just seems to me that the emphasis and the ambition has moved away from reviewing building regs on a more consistent event. So those are the two things. You know, it's budget and you know, where the regulations sit for me.
Yeah, no, that sounds brilliant. I guess a quick thing would be, how can we support you with lobbying the government for that VAT?
Gosh, I mean, honestly, everybody I know that's involved in our industry has had a go. I mean, you know, people like Jason Orme and Michael Holmes, who are publishers around Home Building and Renovating magazine, who are big in the self-build market. They've been into government and lobbied. The RBA president, the RICS president, all of those people have done, you know, quite a lot in terms of lobbying, but for one reason or another, and it's not just, you know, a particular government on a political colour. This spans over a number of periods of governments. So
yeah, okay, yeah.
I don't know what the answer is, I'm afraid.
All right, well, that's a question for all you guys here. How can we help reduce that VAT? If you've got any ideas, pop me an email. I'll be sending you guys a CPD certificate. So if you've got any ideas or whatever, please do send that over to me. All right, we've got 2 minutes to the end of the panel discussion. So if anyone does have any questions, I saw there were some beforehand, but it looks like they were based at you, Graham, Hendra, on heat pumps, and they look like they've all been answered. But if anyone else has a question, please do either unmute yourself and ask it now, or pop it in the chat box. We really only have a few minutes to go for it. But if not, then I will end the panel discussion now. Oh, we've got one from Simon Matthews. How do we enable spending on retrofit for the majority who have limited budgets? I feel like Graham Locke, you're going to be Graham Locke and Darren may be able to answer this one pretty well.
Yeah, I'll have a first go. I mean, I think it's this pragmatic approach that Graham and Darren were advocating earlier, actually, just to encourage people to make a start, because making a start is better than doing nothing. And the heat pump industry, I think, has got a major role to play here in simplifying the message, extolling the benefits more clearly and consistently, and hopefully, with the support now of funding, because the government is providing some funding, and there will be a rush to that cash. So I think we should all be encouraging people to do something, even if it's not perhaps as ambitious as we might all hope, but at least get them started on this journey.
Brilliant, thank you. Darren, do you have anything else to add to that one?
I mean, I think the only other one is to probably take a bit of advice around, you know, sort of tax advice. If you're going to buy a property, is to understand the tax advice around that particular property, because for certain properties where there's been no council tax paid on that for say 3 years, you can reduce where they've been empty, you can reduce the VAT. But most people don't know that. You know, going back to Graham's point earlier about the fact that, you know, most people don't know, you know, what a heat pump looks like, what it can do. I think it's about sharing information out into the market so that everybody knows when they come to buy a house, you know, they've got a choice to make. But you know, that's quite difficult to get out there. But again, it's about PR and marketing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. All right, we've got 2 questions and that's all the time we'll have to go over. So Harry says they reduce VAT on some elements like heat pumps. Graham, can you just see if that is the case?
Yes, so if you put a heat pump in your house tomorrow, you do not pay any VAT.
Brilliant. There you go, Harry. Okay, Andy says, how do we prevent a strategy for retrofit leading to inappropriate materials being used, e.g. like impermeable insulation being used in old buildings with permeable fabric in order to chase a low U value? I think, Jen, you'll be grand at answering this one.
Yeah, sure. So this is you know, when you're insulating older properties, you've got to be you've got to consider moisture management through that fabric, and it is challenging. It's going to be training of installers and awareness. Training and awareness. There's no quick fix for that one, unfortunately.
No, as Graham Locke said earlier, the skills gap it's a difficult one, not easy to answer, and there's a lot of strategy issues around that as well. So yeah, okay, that's brilliant. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks so much for the panelists. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to all you guys and your experience within the sector. I'm going to end the session here. Your CPD certificates will be out later today. And if you want to watch it over again, we'll pop it up on YouTube. All right, thank you everyone.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks.